Those bottles are tough to open. Thank you. On our third panel today, I'd like to recognize Thomas Schatz. He is President of Citizens Against Government Waste. Mr. Andrew Moylan is Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Taxpayers Union. And Mr. Gary Kalman is Director of U.S. PIRG Federal Legislative Office. As you saw in the previous panel, pursuant to the rules, all witnesses will be sworn. If you please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. I will tell you that we prefer to have only one main panel, but we have saved the best for last, since it is this committee's primary duty to work with watchdog groups and and whistleblowers. You are among the most important people that ever come before us. So we look forward to your testimony, Mr. Schatz. I'm sorry. Please try to stick to 5 minutes, and we'll have a lively round of questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cummings. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I've appeared before this committee regardless of who's been chairman, because we hope that we do contribute nonpartisan information about where the government can become more efficient. I am Thomas A. Schatz, President of Citizens Against Government Waste. CAGW was founded back in 1984 to build support for implementation of President Ronald Reagan's Grace Commission recommendations and other waste-cutting proposals. Since then, we have helped save more than $1.08 trillion through the implementation of those recommendations. GAO's high-risk series is a valuable contribution to the effort to eliminate wasteful spending. We have long recognized the importance of this report. Back in 1993, CAGW produced a report called Risky Business, which summarized the GAO high-risk series. That was the year we also first produced Prime Cuts, a compilation of recommendations from GAO, CBO, members of Congress, and other sources, and I ask that the entire Prime Cuts report be entered into the record for this hearing.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The most recent report identified 763 recommendations that would save taxpayers $350 billion in 1 year and $2.2 trillion over 5 years. CAGW has also published this week critical waste issues for the 112th Congress, and there are 10 of our top recommendations in there. I also ask that this report be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. That list includes reforming or eliminating outdated and inequitable agriculture subsidies, common sense ideas such as replacing the $1 bill with the $1 coin, preventing further exposure to hundreds of billions of dollars in taxpayer-funded bailouts by reforming Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and promoting innovation in the private sector by keeping the government from regulating the Internet. There are several recommendations within Prime Cuts that stand out more than others. The Market Access Program, for example, helps agricultural producers promote U.S. products overseas. Both President Obama and the Republican Study Committee have identified this as a source of waste. Simply put, it's corporate welfare when companies like Sunkist, which reported $860.5 million in revenues in 2009, received $2.1 million from this program to promote its products overseas. We have been looking closely at the dollar coin, and we understand that the Government Accountability Office will be issuing a new report next month on how savings can be achieved in that area. We're not quite sure that Congress will be able to score it, as we think it will save money, and something that really should be a very simple decision for the United States, which is the only country that has such a low denomination for its paper currency. Savings from GAO several years ago were $500 million a year. We will see what those numbers appear to be in this next report. As I mentioned, we've looked at other areas, ethanol program, sugar program, dairy, peanuts, NASA Constellation, and then there are programs that sound well-intentioned, such as the Prevention and Public Health Fund that will spend more than $14 billion over the next 10 years under the health care law on anti-obesity and tobacco control. In other words, the government will be using tax dollars to try to modify individual behavior. We've seen this work not so well in the Office of National Drug Control Policy with anti-drug ads, and we hope that this committee will look at this not just for whether or not it's effective, but also whether some of the grantees are using this money to in turn lobby for more regulations and higher taxes, which don't usually solve that problem. And finally, looking at oversight generally, I was very, very pleased to see, Mr. Chairman, that you said last October that oversight is not and should not be used as a political weapon. We understand that that's the most important function of this committee. Taxpayers deserve to know, as you said in your mission statement, how their money is being spent. When this committee or any other committee decides that a program is not being effective, taxpayers want to know why, so that when action is taken to reform or terminate the expenditure of their money, they want to know why it's being done, and if something is being expanded, they want to know why it's being effective. We've often suggested that constituents ask their members of Congress for the 10 most effective and the 10 least effective programs. Unfortunately, the answer often is the 10 programs on which Congress spends the most money and the 10 programs on which they spend the least money. That's never the right answer, and we hope that every member becomes more educated and spends a lot more time reviewing which programs truly are effective. Thank you for allowing me to testify today.
Thank you. Mr. Moreland.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Issa and Ranking Member Cummings, for allowing me to testify today on behalf of the American taxpayer. My name is Andrew Moylan, and I'm Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Taxpayers Union. We are a nonpartisan citizen group founded in 1969 to work for lower taxes and smaller government at all levels. We are the oldest such organization in the world. We have 362,000 members nationwide in every single state and likely in all of your districts as well. I'll start with an old joke that our budget tells us what we can't afford, but it sure doesn't keep us from spending money on it. And unfortunately, that's been true of Washington for far too long. Our current situation is bleak, and I wanted to point out just a couple of nuggets to illustrate that. First of all, President Obama's recent budget estimated our overspending problem this year at roughly $1.6 trillion, which is equal in inflation-adjusted terms to the entire federal budget of 1982. To restate that a bit, we will raise through the tax code and spend in real terms roughly the federal budget of 2003, and on top of that, we will also spend the budget of 1982, again in real terms. Second, in the President's budget outline, the lowest single-year deficit in the coming decade is $607 billion, which is a number higher in absolute terms than every deficit from 1789 to 2008, and roughly equal in, again, real terms to overspending in war-mobilized 1944. Finally, while many in Congress have attributed the recent spending surge to crisis response due to a financial meltdown and the resulting recession, the federal government has actually run a deficit in 51 of the last 60 years, which is something that we think ought to give pause even to diehard Keynesians who believe that in economic growth cycles that surpluses should be the norm. But instead of listing just the parade of horribles, I wanted to try and draw up a parade of solutions for you. There's a lot of hard stuff that needs to be done, and much of that we deal with in the written testimony that I submitted to the committee. But I wanted to instead focus my remarks on what we regard as the low-hanging fruit of waste. It won't shock anyone in this committee to hear that NTU thinks that the federal government spends too much money, but whether or not you agree with that assessment, I hope you can agree that we can spend that money in a much smarter fashion than we are today. And that's why we joined with the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, with whom we have many disagreements, but some agreements as well, to author a report called Toward Common Ground, Bridging the Political Divide to Reduce Spending. And in that report, we identified over 30 specific recommendations to reduce federal spending by up to $600 billion by tackling waste by the middle part of the decade. And incidentally, I would note that NTU and PIRG were sitting together before the State of the Union made it cool, as our previous work includes issues like spending transparency. To steal a joke from Conan O'Brien, I heard that President Obama took his daughters to see the 3D version of Avatar, and at the end of the film, one of his daughters elbowed him and said, "Now that's how you spend $500 million." And unfortunately, American taxpayers are spending over $500 billion on such things as flood insurance for repeatedly flooded homes, overpayments through the SSI program and the National Drug Intelligence Center, which is located in the heart of the drug war in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, among many, many other things. These items have been on watchdog lists for years, and opposition to these recommendations tends not to be primarily political or ideological in nature, but parochial. Just a couple of the highlights: $62 billion in savings we identified from eliminating wasteful subsidies for agricultural products and corporations, $353 billion in improvements to contracting and asset acquisition, $77 billion in improvements to program execution, and $107 billion in canceling or modifying ineffective military programs. I would note that our earlier estimates were actually closer to $1 trillion by the middle part of the decade, but we tried as hard as we could to back up each one of these suggestions with a credible estimate of the real spending impact, as well as an unimpeachable source like CBO or GAO. The NTU PIRG report demonstrates that reducing wasteful spending is not a question of right or left, it's a question of right or wrong. And I'll conclude by noting that I believe that this hearing is properly focused on the issue of really what's causing our budget woes, which is overspending. While revenue is set to return to post-war averages in relatively short order, even if we do extend all of the 2001-2003 tax cuts, spending is projected to be well above post-war averages for the coming decade and will skyrocket after that. And that's why it's important for Congress to eliminate wasteful spending, tackle entitlement reforms, and institute constitutional limits on the size of government moving forward. If we fail to seize that opportunity, the result could be a painful debt crisis that will develop not over the span of 6 months, but over the span of 6 hours on a Sunday evening as we're sitting with our families and folks in Asian markets are beginning to stampede away from American debt. To modify a line from our president, I hope we can look back together on this time and say that this was the moment when the rise of red ink began to slow and our budget began to heal. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kalman.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, I thank you for inviting me to testify today on behalf of the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, U.S. PIRG. U.S. PIRG, the Federation of State PIRGs, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that advocates and educates on matters to encourage a fair and sustainable economy, protect the public health, and foster responsive democratic government. The level of Federal spending is of great concern to Americans. A November Pew Research Center poll showed that 70% of Americans believe Federal spending is an urgent problem. Other opinion research indicates that the public concerns are focused on waste, whether it is fought for and won by narrow interests, programs that have outlived their usefulness, or blatant inefficiencies that have been allowed to continue for years. We are proud to have partnered with the National Taxpayers Union to develop the list of spending reductions detailed in our October 2010 report, Toward Common Ground. The report details more than $600 billion in specific spending cuts over 5 years. These spending cuts are a good place to start, but not only because of the current budget situation. In good fiscal times and bad, during years of budget surpluses or deficits, taxpayers deserve to know that their money is being well spent, that it is going to true public priorities, and that there is accountability in the system through common sense reforms. While there is any number of issues that may divide U.S. PIRG and NTU, and our respective memberships, there are broad areas where we can come together and support responsible and accountable spending of taxpayer dollars. One message of our joint report is for Congress to start where there is agreement from across the political spectrum. I'd like to share with you U.S. PIRG's approach to the spending cuts. We entered our partnership with NTU guided by 4 basic principles. First, to oppose subsidies that provide incentives to companies that do direct harm to the public interest or do more harm than good. An example here, we would say, is subsidies to ethanol, for which, according to researchers at the University of Minnesota and elsewhere, there is very little, if any, truth to the benefits of ethanol, and there are clearly adverse environmental impacts. Second, we oppose subsidies to mature, profitable industries that don't need the incentive. These companies would engage in the activity regardless of taxpayer support. We would include in this category subsidies, as has been mentioned by now all 3 of us, the Market Access Program, which, among other things, effectively pay for overseas television advertising and other marketing of specific products to successful multi-billion-dollar companies. These companies have both the incentive and the resources to do their own product promotion without taxpayer handouts. Third, support common-sense reforms to make the government more efficient. Examples here include the reducing of the inventory of unused or underused government buildings, as was mentioned before, as Congresswoman Spears pointed out, we have a lot to do in contracting and would be happy to talk later on about a report we did called Forgiving Fraud and Failure, which was the repeated issuance of contracts and renewing of contracts despite the fact that they didn't deliver. Fourth, and finally, we would oppose funding where there is authoritative consensus to do so. This means strong independent agreement across the political spectrum that a program is wasteful, and the agency or department receiving the funding has actually argued against it. A specific example is here, again, just to repeat, the National Drug Intelligence Center, which has been the subject of numerous unfavorable reports about its impact and effectiveness. The GAO has concluded that it duplicates existing efforts. A particular value of the recommendations detailed in the report is that they are specific. They focus on agreed-upon wasteful spending. Along those lines, I would just note that U.S. PERG does not actually support across-the-board cuts. Such policies fail to differentiate between true public priorities and where there is genuine waste or inefficiencies in the system. Americans certainly prioritize national defense, but if efficiencies can be made to the way in which we repair military vehicles, the military is often exempt from across-the-board cuts, that savings is no less important than reforms to streamline the costs of Medicare. While not in the report, U.S. PERG would also urge the committee to review special interest carve-outs through tax expenditures and loopholes. These expenditures have the same bottom-line effect on our nation's deficit as direct line-item spending. Regardless of whether spending takes place through the tax code or the appropriations process, it should be part of the conversation and should be transparent, accountable, and serve the public. Let me end by saying that many of the items on our list challenge long-standing subsidies to narrow special interests. While these expenditures serve little or no continuing public purpose, there will no doubt be intense lobbying efforts to preserve the handouts. We urge you to resist those efforts and take the first important steps towards addressing our Federal spending problem and ensuring that any public expenditure is for the public interest. We applaud the committee for looking anew at these giveaways and urge you to challenge tradition in the difficult decisions to reform the budget, decisions that lie ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize myself for first round of questioning for 5 minutes. Mr. Schatz, your critical waste issue of the 112th Congress, it has an area that piqued my interest on page 17, and I would ask unanimous consent that this entire document be placed in the record. Without objection, so ordered. But on page 17, it makes a statement, USA Today, I guess, is the source for it, that 83% of all public employee jobs pay greater than their comparable private sector counterparts. When we're looking at trying to figure out waste, would you categorize paying more than what the private sector pays for comparable work as a waste, and if so, would this be perhaps the largest waste there is in all of government?
There are some caveats that went with that proposal. There was some arguments that Federal workers are more educated on average than the private sector workers. But looking at apples to apples, we'd like to see a report from the Congress that really details where this lies. I mean, the Cato Institute has looked at this for years, and I think people used to believe that this was not the case. I think currently, based both on compensation and benefits, that public employees at every level of government are being paid at a higher level. Now, whether that means there are too many of them, they're overcompensated, are we getting something out of them that's worth that compensation? These are all questions that need to be examined. So we don't want to say just, we do actually think that Federal salaries should be reduced because private sector, if you have a job, you're lucky to have one. Most people haven't had a raise. I was encouraged that the President has looked at salaries and said we should freeze them. That's a good first step. But then we have to determine which programs are worth continuing, and within there, what's a fair rate of pay so that we are really not overpaying. As I said, compensation benefits in particular, especially the benefits, now are much better than the private sector.
One of the questions I'd have following up on that would be, do you believe the government can come up with a, and I'll use the British word, scheme, in which we can have a dynamic pay schedule similar to the private sector so that we don't underpay? Because obviously some of the public sector employees are underpaid compared to comparable private sector, and this is often where we get a drain. So do you believe it's possible at all for the Federal government to significantly improve so that we don't overpay and underpay, And wouldn't that be inherently a complete change in our schedules?
Absolutely. We've seen a lot of changes over the years, or attempts to change civil service compensation. I recall when President Carter came in, that was one of the first things he did, and nobody really talked to him for a while after that. But it is something that needs to be done. It needs to be done on a bipartisan basis. There are some very high-level and very well-educated positions that we do need. Think about security or nuclear weapons. I mean, you can't just take somebody off the street, essentially, and have them perform that task. So they may be underpaid compared to the private sector, but one of the examples given in here was a cook, literally,
right, I noticed
being
that.
paid at a far greater rate than a comparable private sector individual. As I said, I think this committee in particular would be well served to come up with something that is objective, that looks at it program by program, and really makes a good determination about what's the fair level, because we could save a lot of money. And we do recommend here, by the way, an across-the-board reduction of 10%. And again, we think that's consistent with what needs to be done to get spending under control in general.
I appreciate that. I'm going to go a little off script, but it's important because I don't often get such a good panel here to go into another area. The first panel, and every panel that's been before Congress so far, has said the only way we're going to get to a reasonably balanced budget, in other words, deal with our overspending, includes waste, includes closing unnecessary programs, it includes pay analysis, but it also includes taking on entitlements. I'm going to ask you the toughest question. Do you believe that Congress can successfully convince the American people that entitlements, Social Security and Medicare, are not, in fact, a entitlement, a absolute health care program for the aged, an absolute retirement program, but rather part of a social welfare safety net, and thus can be means tested?
I think that that's one approach, certainly. Raising the retirement age is another. People are living longer. You may not recall this, but the first individual that received Social Security was named Ida Mae Fuller. She lived until she was, I believe, 88, which was far longer than they expected. And so the actuarial tables are not accurate. There was an anomaly, for example, in Medicare when it was first enacted that also looked at how long people live, because you can't have an insurance program or a payment program and have it be sustainable financially if they're going to pay out more than they take in. It's just simple math. So there are a lot of ways to look at reforming these programs. We think that it has to be done. We were encouraged that the President said.
Right, but I'm asking you for the tougher. I'm asking you for the tougher question here.
About whether it's social welfare or
can we define it as social welfare safety net? I'll use the entire term, so that we can, in fact, means test in some way both of those programs, at least partially, because everybody says there's only so many solutions. That's the one that's seldom talked about, which is the only way to say that if you're like myself and you have enough income outside of Congress, that when I'm 70, I actually won't need my Social Security in order to still be well-to-do. Yes or no, do you believe Congress has the ability to convince the American people, separate from do they have the will?
I think that conversation needs to be started, because if it's thought of as an entitlement, people don't want to give it up. We have a health care bill where now people think health care is an entitlement.
Okay, I appreciate that.
So I think it's really expanding more than it's being reduced.
Please,
Mr. Chairman, if I may, do I think that Congress has the ability? Yes, I do. Am I convinced that Congress will utilize that ability? That I'm not so convinced of yet. And the way that I keep talking to people about these programs is that whether we like it or not, they are gutting themselves from the inside right now. If we do not make serious changes to them, we're going to rapidly approach the point where Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security take up nearly as large a portion of our economy as a whole as the entire Federal budget today. And to be able to head that off, we need to start entitlement reform now.
Thank you. Mr. Kalman, just a yes or no if you could. If you can. I'll come back in a second round otherwise.
Yeah,
okay, thank you. I now recognize the ranking member.
I was just listening to you all's testimony. It's very interesting. And when it comes, you all heard the Senator McCaskill. Were you all here for that? Yes, and you heard all the discussion with regard to these contracts that we are particularly in defense, we don't seem to be in control of. I just wondered, what comments did you have on that, Mr. Moore?
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Could you be brief, because I have a number of things I want.
It's an extraordinarily important part of the puzzle in terms of tackling wasteful spending, and that was actually a big part of the report that we did with U.S. PERG, is identifying some of those reforms that could be made. The Bipartisan Defense Acquisition Panel made some very worthwhile suggestions, and those are part of our report.
If I may briefly, we were around when the Clinger-Cohen Act came along. We've seen a lot of defense procurement. 25% of the Grace Commission's recommendations dealt with defense, and our organization helped publicize the $436 hammers and the $640 toilet seats. So we're well aware of what needs to be done in contracting and defense.
And I'm just wondering, when you look at your organizations and you're dedicated to effective and efficient use of taxpayer dollars, and you hear, I think it was Ms. Spear who talked about how frustrating it is to constantly be going over these problems over and over and over again, and we end up looking kind of, it looks as if we can't get it done, or else we don't want to get it done. And then we look at all the resources that are being put into these hearings, and don't get me wrong, I'm glad that the Chairman held this hearing, and I'm glad that we're on the road that we are on our way to. But I guess what I'm trying to get to is that, I mean, the older I get, the more I value my time. And I'm trying to make sure that the time that we have under our watch, all of ours, is that we do something to actually make a difference. And so I appreciate the fact that these two organizations got together. That's great. I think that's a good start. But I'm just trying to figure out, what do you want? I mean, what do you see? In other words, I'm trying to get to, how do we not be where Ms. Spear talked about, where 2 years from now we're talking about the same problems and they're getting worse. And we were able to make some difference in the Coast Guard. That's a smaller organization, but it was through just sheer pushing and setting deadlines, as the Chairman often talks about. I mean, but what do you all? I mean, how do you work yourself out of a job? That's what I'm trying to get to.
Mr. Chairman, I've been at this probably longer than these gentlemen.
Yeah, and I don't want you.
But
do you understand how serious? I'm very serious about this.
No,
I don't want you to. I mean, you do a great job, but I don't want you to die.
Right.
Still fighting, and the problem is worse.
Well, part of the problem is the priorities in Congress. That members traditionally have been happier spending the money, putting their name on a road or a building, and taking credit for doing something, whatever it might be, because they think that might help them get reelected, to be perfectly frank. If we can get enough members that say, I will fix a problem because that's the right thing to do, they'll probably get reelected with an even bigger majority, because they'll be able to go back home and say, look, I did something that made the government work better. We don't want people to have less faith in the government. And yes, we talk a lot about what's wrong, because that really gets people's attention. But fixing it is really something that needs to be at the forefront of people's minds. A lot of times agency heads come in, presidents come in and say, let's fix the problem. There's entrenched bureaucracy that doesn't want to change. So it has to be an effort that is a collaboration between the executive branch, Congress, among these organizations, and so that when people look at something, they say, we're going to give you credit for fixing the problem, not just going around spending money.
Congressman, I think it is a great question, and I am glad you all are focused on this. I would say a couple of things. One is that it is the fact that we need, I think, to start where we can agree. In other words, a lot of these fights end up happening at the places we disagree. And so the value, and what I said in my testimony and would reiterate, is the value of a group like NTU partnering with U.S. PERG gives you a roadmap for a few places where, if parties got together and said this is where we can go, then you would have actually backup from folks that can talk to their memberships across the country. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is there are some places where there has been progress made, not obviously enough. But last year, in a unanimously through the House, there was acquisitions reforms that were made to the weapons procurement system That took care of about 20% of the problem. But if we can go after weapons systems, which arguably is one of the harder things to go after, then hopefully we can introduce and get a bill, you all can pass a bill that would take care of the remaining 80%. So I think there are building blocks on which you can focus on to make some serious progress. Over in the Senate side is the last thing I would say, on a number of, for example, issues like offshore tax havens, which is not necessarily something that everybody agrees on. Mr. Grassley and Mr. Lemon are getting together and talking about how to close some of those abuses and ways to raise some revenue. So I think there are things and seeds that are out there, but we need to focus on where we agree.
May I? I think that, and I submitted this in my written testimony, that the math on the dollars and cents is easy. It's the political calculus that's been difficult. And just to explain part of that, President Obama's recent budget had some suggestions for terminations, over $1 billion of which were repeated suggestions from President Bush's last proposed budget. So there are $1 billion worth of reductions that both of those very different men agreed upon that have still not been implemented in terms of reductions. I think that those are things that we ought to be targeting. That's the low-hanging fruit. We identified $600 billion more that we think is low-hanging fruit. And after that point, that's when we can climb up a little higher, fight about what fruit to pick and how big they ought to be. And I can say that we as an organization and I as an individual am committed to making that political calculus easier, because that's the only way we're ever going to get this done.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear, for 5 minutes.
I've got to say that if there ever was a moment in time when we can come together and show the American people that Republicans and Democrats want to save the taxpayers' money, and we commit to do that from this committee, I mean, we can change the world in a small way, but a very significant way. And I think the fact that Mr. Moylan and Mr. Kalman have come together from very different places and have created a list for us of things that they can agree on, then I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, we should sit down and see if we can agree on these particular suggested areas. I mean, if in fact the suggestion that we can save hundreds of millions of dollars by just ending the orders for obsolete spare parts for the military, come on, if we can't do that, we should get the heck out of here. So I would suggest that we take this list, we come together, and this committee come forward with, at the very least, you know, a number, if not all, of these suggested savings. I want to see, if we have buildings, we've got 55,000 federal buildings that are not utilized or underutilized. Let's just take the not utilized ones and get rid of those. Or the folks that are living in areas that continue to flood, and we're spending $891 million on repeat claims, where 1% of the policies are generating 25 to 30% of the claims. I'd like to know what that specific number is. We could probably give them $500,000 apiece to buy homes in other areas and save a lot of money. So those are the kinds of things that I'd like to see us pursue, Mr. Chairman. Let me just ask about this market access program. This, to me, is pretty outrageous, that we're paying Sunkist and McDonald's to advertise in France and other locales around the world. What could possibly justify us to continue that program? Will each of you respond to that?
We've all been looking at this for quite some time. NTU and CAGW have co-signed letters on this program for probably 10 years. Representative Chavit from Ohio, who was recently reelected, used to bring amendments to the floor every year on the appropriations bills. I believe an amendment was being offered on the continuing resolution. I don't know what happened to it. I do know, by the way, the National Drug Intelligence Center amendment was adopted, so hopefully that will finally disappear. But market access, it is the power of the companies that get the money that keeps it going. And we hope that there is now the political will to say this is a huge amount of corporate welfare, should be eliminated. There has been bipartisan support, but just not a majority so far. But it's really due to the power of these companies and their lobbying operations to come in and say, no, no, we really need this $1 million. It's going to help increase sales, help jobs, and by the way, we have a plant in your district.
I would say that while it's absolutely key to point out that there are large corporations that are benefiting from it. It's not just corporations. There are also large trade associations that are, of course, comprised of a lot of those that benefit as well. And they make very high-minded arguments about raising demand for certain types of products. There was an article recently where a gentleman was making the argument that we need to raise foreign demand for cotton so that we have greater demand for the products that cotton farmers in this country are producing. The way that we look at it as an organization is that entities like this that have significant profits on their own ought to be able to fund their own advertising and promotion techniques. And taxpayers have many more important things to deal with. And whether, as Gary said, whether the budget situation is good or bad, it does not make sense to be subsidizing entities like that.
And I would just quickly add that, there is presumably a debate to be had whether or not the Commerce Department has a role in going out to open up foreign markets for American businesses. When you start saying, no, we're going to give specific companies to advertise to sell Big Macs in Paris, the argument really begins to fall into the absurdity. And so we would argue that whatever original purpose the program may have had, it's completely veered off that original purpose and is now not serving any kind of purpose that promotes any value to the American taxpayer.
By the way, very cleverly, they changed the name from the Market Promotion Program. It was promoting our products to market access, meaning we want access to markets overseas because they may be excluding our products. So even there, it sounds even a little better than what they had in the past.
My time has almost expired. Just tell me some of the companies. Besides Sunkist and McDonald's, who are the other companies receiving money?
Our report notes Nabisco, Fruit of the Loom, Mars Incorporated. There's a long list of many others where that came from.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'm going to do a very brief second round. Mr. Kelman, I kind of cut you off without being able to answer the question, but I'll rephrase it. I'll do it this way. I had a prominent bank chairman, somebody with a 7-figure salary and the large home in a low-tax state, who came in to see me. He's a little older than his wife. He has a 10 and a 12-year-old, but he's over 65. His 2 children each receive $800 a month because back in Lyndon Johnson's day, we decided that retirees should have supplemental funds and death benefits that would go to the children directly over and above. We talked about corporate welfare. Is there any reason today that that shouldn't be part of the waste within Social Security? If somebody's making a 6- or 7-figure salary, just because they're over 65 and have children under 18, should we automatically continue that? And that's why when I said entitlement, everything's an entitlement once we write it into law. But is it really an entitlement to somebody who doesn't need the money and for a program that actually never defined its real purpose? Is there a purpose to give children under 18 $800 simply because one of their parents is over 65, even if that parent is still working and earning a handsome income? So I'll leave it to you because this is about waste. It's about government waste. But the 2 biggest potential rocks in the knapsack of our country that might take us down are Social Security and Medicare in the opposite order. If you'd like to respond.
Sure.
And by the way, that's not going to completely balance the budget if we just do away with the high income over 65 with children under 18.
I understand and appreciate that. Let me say 2 things. One is just to be quite frank is that U.S. PERG doesn't take positions on the level of benefits for Social Security or Medicare. That said, we actually do have in our—
And the question wasn't is that a wrong benefit? Is it the type of benefit that Congress should look at anew relative to recategorizing it in some way for means testing, or at least not to make it an automatic entitlement?
Yeah, and I apologize, but we don't have a specific position on that.
Okay.
But let me say this, that we do think that, for example, there are a number of things in Medicare and Medicaid that, in particular, that should be looked at. We're not against looking at that. In fact, in Medicaid, for example, there are a number of states that in which name brand pharmaceuticals have put on their gotten into the states to adopt actuaries that forbid Medicaid from purchasing generic drug alternatives. So Medicaid ends up spending a lot more money than they otherwise would.
They've lobbied for built-in monopolies.
Protection. So we would say, people who say, oh, we should leave entitlements off the table, we think that there are huge efficiencies, billions and billions of taxpayer dollars that that program that's not just, I mean, obviously we can all agree on the actual fraud in Medicare. We should go after that.
If I guarantee you housing, it shouldn't have to be the Ritz-Carlton.
Exactly. We should, so we do believe that there are opportunities to make huge savings in those programs by looking at how they're actually being implemented. On that side, we can agree.
Any other responses?
I would also point out, and you touched on the public opinion portion of it, that I think that there is something of a structural problem in how these programs are viewed. People are well aware of the payments that they make into these systems for years and decades, and so I think they, to some extent, rightly feel that when they get to retirement age, that they ought to be able to draw upon those benefits as they were promised to them.
If they only knew that they only pay into Part A, B, C, and D, are not in fact paid for out of withholding, but rather through general tax revenue?
Well, and it's a more basic problem than that, which is that when Social Security was first drawn up, it was not something akin to a forced savings program. We had this pay-as-you-go system, and I think that that's a part of the big disconnect that we face here today, and that's a part of what makes dealing with these programs more difficult than it might otherwise be.
I'm going to ask one closing question very quickly, because this one hits home. In a little while, I think we're going to have an amendment we're going to vote on to make an across-the-board cut to the branch, literally to consider further cutting the budget that the ranking member and I share to try to go after waste and misuse of government funds. And I'm probably going to vote no, because I don't believe you cut off the auditor's fund in order to get a better running of an enterprise. But in this report that's already in, I noticed something. There's a proposal here that members of Congress cut off franking in election years. In other words, not just 90 days, but cut it off altogether. I'd appreciate a little elaboration, because I found it to be very insightful that although I think we should be able to respond to inquiries, in other words, our mail should continue, the history of franking right up until the eve of the cutoff for the primary or general is certainly something that if we look at ourselves through a fair mirror, we're going to see something we don't like.
Well, first, the Senate does limit franking.
The gentlelady was going to, I yield to her.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say that I have discovered the franking, quote, benefit to be outrageous. And if you want to associate on that issue, I would be delighted.
I thank the gentleman.
To think, and I found that out by happenstance. I was doing a one-a-year newsletter to my constituents to tell them what I had done during the year, and found out it was going to cost $100,000 to send it out, and I refused to do it. And with the eve of the electronic newsletter and everything else we have at our disposal, I think that benefit should cease.
But please,
well, as we said in the report, in the days of the Pony Express, this might have made sense, but it certainly doesn't now. There's so much information, Twitter, Facebook, MySpace, I don't want to leave anyone out, email, texting, town hall meetings, teletown halls. If a member of Congress wishes to let their constituents know what they're doing, there are so many outlets now that did not exist before that we believe firmly, and we've always believed this, that a member of Congress should only respond to a constituent if they're asked a question, and because that's a legitimate function of what members of Congress do. We've got C-SPAN, we've got everything going on. There's more information now about the hearings with the new rules.
We are both being advertised here today with this hearing, I'm sure.
Exactly. So I think that this is something whose time is coming. I know NTU in particular has done a great job on this issue over the years. So I would love to have Andrew make a comment as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've done a tremendous amount of work on abuses of the franking process, but I wanted to touch on sort of the more general point that you made. I often make the argument that one of the reasons that I believe so deeply in limited government is precisely because I don't think that we spend enough money on the things that matter. And that's why across-the-board cuts ought to be sort of a last resort rather than a first resort, because as our organizations jointly have pointed out and many others, there are higher priority things and there are lower priority things. And we ought to start by eliminating the lower priority things first. And so I think that a franking benefit is among those. And as Tom pointed out, there are innumerable ways that you can communicate with your constituents that don't require taxpayers to underwrite it, and I think that we ought to pursue those.
Thank you. And I know that if I'd gotten into the study of malt liquor and marijuana in combination, which is being funded, we might have had another 10 minutes, but I recognize the ranking member for final comments.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for being here. And I just want to go to you, Mr. Shasta, just make one quick comment. You know, I was listening to your responses and with regard to public employees. I think we have to be very, very careful when we try to make these comparisons and contrasts. And I think you've been sensitive to it. I look at, and so, you know, I know you all speak in a lot of places and you tell a lot of stories, but this is one I want you to tell. Almost every one of my employees on this committee took a substantial pay cut. They were here, they're here night after night. Many of them, we have a Harvard Law School graduates, I mean, sitting right up here. And I'm sure that, I don't know what happened on the other side, but what I'm saying is that we've got a lot of great people who do a lot of sacrificing. And I tell you, it makes me want to scream sometimes when I hear, and I'm not just talking about Democrats, I'm talking about Republican staff too, about public employees and how they are, you know, got these high salaries and, you know, they couldn't do better in private industry. I guarantee you most of them could, but we've got a lot of people who dedicate their lives to just trying to do what is right and make things better for people. And I get kind of emotional about it because I hear it over and over again, and I think it's quite unfair so often. Then I want to talk about this whole thing of systemic fraud. I'm going to be doing I'm doing a speech at Howard University soon. Well, I'm going to be talking about the fact that we need to create a new normal. And that is that it seems like when I listen to the thing about contracting, I think it has become normal for certain contractors to expect to fraudulently get money from the government. It has become a part of the process. And that's sad. It really is. And so that's the normal. And I mean, then when, and I think it was the chairman maybe that was asking questions about, you know, it was somebody on the Republican side, and it was a very good question about is this criminal? Is it whatever? And I think it was Mr. Dodaro who said, yeah, he said something about, well, there's a certain threshold that we look at and whatever. But the fact is that the normal has become, let's, you know, get something from the government. Mm-hmm. And I am convinced that we can do better than that. We really can. And when I think about where we are with regard, and I was mentioning this to the chairman a few minutes ago, where we are with regard to technology. Mm-hmm. You know, the things, I mean, we can literally take GPS and zero in on somebody's backyard. Mm-hmm. You mean to tell me we can't keep up with contracts? I mean, particularly when these contracts are costing the American people so much money. I agree with the chairman with regard to our mission statement. This is bigger than us. This is about, and it's bigger than one party. It's bigger than Democrats or Republicans. It's about taking the hard-earned dollars of Americans and trying to make sure that they're spent effectively and efficiently. And you know, the two things that I just said are linked. The thing about employees, we got a lot of great employees, and I think we need to be careful about beating up on them all the time because, and I'm not just talking about the people up here. Mm-hmm. They're the same public employees that, you know, collect our trash, the same ones that deliver our mail. I mean, that's real. And a lot of these people, I think, probably most of them are underpaid. And at the same time, we also need to use our technology to, you know, we got the bashing over here, but then we need to move to our technology and say, okay, how do we use this technology to bring that effectiveness and efficiency to government to help those employees accomplish the things that they need to accomplish. That's what it's all about. And so we can spend, and we've been concentrating on spending here lately. But we also need to, and I think the Chairman said it in his opening, that when we find ways that we can save money, we need to double down on that. We need to do that, because if we can save some pennies, that means everybody benefits. And when government is really doing things effectively and efficiently, we all benefit. And then that way we bring value, more value, to the lives of all Americans. And that's what it's all about. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank our witnesses today. I think if there's ever a time in which points were scored for the American people and not by one party or the other here on the dais, today was that day. I'd again like to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. The record will stay open for 7 days. If there are additional comments that you'd like to have placed in the record, I'd ask unanimous consent at this time that you be able to do so. And without objection, so ordered. And with that, we stand adjourned.